I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would empty a family bank account in the middle of the night, but there I was at 2:47 a.m., transferring every penny while my parents slept peacefully upstairs, completely unaware that their golden boy's safety net had just disappeared. It all started 3 weeks earlier when I came home early from work with a migraine. I was fumbling for my keys when I heard voices from the living room. My dad's voice was crystal clear through the thin walls of our family home. "Brandon, don't worry about the startup debt. We'll make Jessica pay for it." I froze. My hand stopped halfway to the doorknob. "That's right," my mom chimed in, her voice carrying that familiar tone she used when discussing my responsibilities. "Daughters are supposed to take care of family. She makes good money at that tech company." "But what if she says no?" Brandon's voice had that whiny quality I'd grown to hate over the years. "She won't say no," Dad replied with absolute certainty. "She never does. Jessica's always been the reliable one." My legs felt like they might give out. I backed away from the door and sat in my car for 20 minutes, hands shaking as their words replayed in my mind. The migraine that had sent me home early suddenly felt like nothing compared to the pounding in my chest. That night changed everything, but to understand why, you need to know how I got to that moment in the first place. My name is Jessica, and I've been my family's financial safety net for as long as I can remember. At 28, I'm a senior software engineer at a growing tech company in Austin, Texas. I live in a modest apartment, drive a reliable Honda Civic, and save 40% of my income. On paper, I'm the picture of financial responsibility. In reality, I've been funding my family's lifestyle and my brother's failures for the past decade. The pattern started when I was 18 and earned my first scholarship to UT Austin. While my parents celebrated my academic achievement, they were already calculating how much money they'd save on my education. That saved money? It went straight to Brandon's college fund at a private university where he majored in business and minored in partying. "Jessica's so independent," they'd tell their friends. "She doesn't need our help like Brandon does." What they really meant was, "Jessica will figure it out, so we can focus our resources on Brandon." By the time I graduated with a computer science degree and landed my first job, the expectation was already set. Family emergencies became my emergencies: car repairs, medical bills, home maintenance. If the family needed money, Jessica would provide it, not because they asked nicely, but because they simply assumed I would. The psychological manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. They never directly demanded money. Instead, they'd create scenarios where saying no felt impossible. Mom would call crying about a medical bill they couldn't afford, conveniently forgetting to mention the vacation they'd booked the week before. Dad would mention how proud he was of my success, then casually bring up Brandon's latest business idea that just needed a small investment. The family dynamic was textbook golden child versus scapegoat. Though I didn't have the vocabulary for it back then, Brandon could do no wrong. When his first business failed, it was market conditions. When his second venture collapsed, it was bad partners. When his third attempt imploded, it was bad timing. Each failure was met with sympathy and encouragement to try again. Meanwhile, if I expressed any hesitation about funding these ventures, I was being selfish or ungrateful for family support. The emotional manipulation was so consistent that I began to believe their version of reality. Maybe I was being selfish. Maybe family was supposed to work this way. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. Family gatherings always ended with subtle pressure for financial help. My parents would praise my career success in the same breath they'd mention Brandon's latest opportunity. They kept detailed mental accounting of every dollar I'd contributed to family expenses, but somehow never tracked what Brandon owed. The most insidious part was how they made me complicit in my own exploitation. They'd frame their requests as opportunities for me to be the good daughter, the successful one who could afford to help. They weaponized my achievements against me, turning my professional success into evidence that I owed the family something. But the real red flag should have been the secrecy. Important family financial decisions were made without my input, then presented as fait accompli that required my funding. I was never consulted, only informed and expected to comply. The psychological toll was devastating. I developed chronic self-doubt, constantly questioning whether my resentment was justified. I became a people pleaser in all areas of life, terrified of conflict and desperate for approval. Setting boundaries felt impossible because I'd been conditioned to believe that love was conditional on my usefulness. By my late 20s, I'd contributed over $180,000 to family expenses, business investments, and Brandon's various failures. That's not including the countless smaller amounts, gas money, groceries, utilities when they were short, that never got paid back. The most painful realization was that my financial support had become so normalized that my parents genuinely believed I owed it to them. In their minds, my success was somehow their success, which meant my money was their money. They'd created a family economy where I was the sole producer and everyone else was a consumer. That overheard conversation wasn't an aberration. It was simply the first time I'd heard them say out loud what they'd been thinking all along. The morning after discovering their plan, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The hurt was still there, sharp and fresh, but underneath it was something new, strategic determination. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't going to react emotionally. I was going to think like the engineer I was trained to be. I called in sick to work and spent the day conducting what I now think of as a family forensics investigation. It started with a simple question: what else didn't I know? The first stop was my computer. My parents had always been technologically challenged, and I'd been their unofficial IT support for years. That meant I had access to their email accounts, supposedly for helping with technical issues. I'd never abused that access before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 months of email correspondence revealed the full scope of their plan. They hadn't just decided to make me pay for Brandon's latest failure. They'd been planning it for months. The startup debt wasn't $30,000, like Brandon had mentioned to his friends. It was $85,000, and my parents had already signed loan documents using me as a co-signer. Without my knowledge or consent, they'd pledged my credit and my financial future to cover Brandon's business venture. The emails showed they'd forged my signature on multiple documents. They'd used my social security number to open business credit lines. They'd listed my income and assets as collateral for loans I'd never seen. But the most devastating discovery was an email chain between my parents and my Aunt Sarah, my mom's sister who lived in California. In response to my aunt's concerns about Brandon's mounting debts, my mother had written, "Don't worry about Brandon. Jessica will take care of everything. She makes plenty of money and doesn't have real expenses like a family. It's the least she can do after everything we've done for her." The casual entitlement in that statement hit me like a physical blow. Real expenses like a family. As if my life, my goals, my future didn't matter, because I hadn't produced grandchildren yet. I printed everything: bank statements, loan documents, email chains, text message screenshots from family group chats where they discussed their financial expectations for me. By the end of the day, I had a file folder 2 inches thick, documenting years of financial manipulation and fraud. The next phase of my investigation focused on understanding the full financial picture. I pulled my credit reports and discovered 3 business loans, totaling $127,000 that I'd supposedly co-signed. I found credit cards in my name that I'd never opened. I discovered that my parents had listed me as a guarantor on their mortgage refinance. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. They hadn't just planned to make me pay for Brandon's latest failure. They'd been systematically leveraging my financial stability for years without my knowledge. But the investigation also revealed something else. They'd underestimated me completely. While they'd been forging documents and making plans, I'd been quietly building my own financial fortress. The joint savings account they planned to raid contained $120,000, money I'd been saving for a house down payment. But what they didn't know was that I had another $200,000 in investment accounts they'd never heard about. More importantly, the joint account was structured in a way that gave me sole authority to move funds. I'd opened it years earlier when my parents needed help with a legitimate emergency, and they'd insisted on being added as signers just in case. What they'd forgotten, or never bothered to understand, was that as the primary account holder, I could remove funds without their permission. The legal research I conducted that week was intensive. I consulted with 2 different attorneys and learned that while my parents had committed fraud by forging my signature, proving it would be difficult and expensive, the better strategy would be to protect my assets preemptively and force them to confront the consequences of their actions. I also reached out to my Aunt Sarah, the one who'd expressed concerns in the email chain. That phone call was revelatory. Sarah had been suspicious of my parents' financial decisions for years, but she'd never known how to help without overstepping family boundaries. When I shared what I'd discovered, she immediately offered to serve as a witness and support system. "I've been waiting for you to wake up," she told me. "Your parents have been taking advantage of your good heart for too long." Having an ally within the family was psychologically crucial. It confirmed that I wasn't crazy or ungrateful. I was being exploited. The final piece of my investigation involved understanding Brandon's actual financial situation. Through mutual friends and social media detective work, I learned that his startup had been failing for months. He'd already burned through his initial investment and 2 rounds of emergency funding from our parents. The $85,000 debt wasn't an investment in a promising business. It was throwing good money after bad to delay an inevitable bankruptcy. More damning was the discovery that Brandon had been living a lifestyle completely disconnected from his business reality. While claiming poverty and asking for family support, He'd been posting photos from expensive restaurants, vacations, and shopping sprees. He was burning through money faster than he could raise it, and our parents were enabling his financial recklessness by promising to make me cover the shortfall. By the end of my week-long investigation, I had a complete picture of the situation. My family hadn't just planned to exploit me. They'd already been doing it for years. They'd committed fraud, damaged my credit, and pledged my future earnings without my consent. They'd created a system where Brandon's irresponsibility became my obligation, and they'd done it all while convincing themselves they were entitled to my money. But I also had something they didn't expect: complete documentation of their actions, legal advice on my options, and a strategic plan to protect myself. The conversation I'd overheard wasn't the beginning of their plan. It was the end of my willingness to be their victim. That night, as I sat in my apartment reviewing all the evidence I'd gathered, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront them with angry accusations or emotional pleas for fairness. I wasn't going to give them the opportunity to gaslight me or make excuses. Instead, I was going to speak the only language they truly understood: money. At 2:47 a.m., while my family slept peacefully in the house I'd helped them keep, I transferred every penny from our joint savings account into my personal account. Then I froze my credit, changed my banking passwords, and began the process of removing myself from every financial entanglement they'd created without my knowledge. The money they'd been counting on to save Brandon's business and maintain their lifestyle was gone. But more importantly, so was their access to my financial future. When they woke up the next morning, they'd discover that their reliable ATM had finally learned to say no. And unlike their previous financial emergencies, this was one problem they'd have to solve without Jessica's money. The real reckoning was still to come, but for the first time in my adult life, I held all the cards. The timing of my strategic strike couldn't have been more perfect. Brandon's 30th birthday was exactly 1 week away, and my parents had already started planning what they called a success celebration for his latest business venture. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were planning to celebrate his success with money they'd stolen from me for a business that was already failing. I spent that week in a state of controlled calm that surprised even me. Years of people-pleasing had trained me to suppress my emotions, but this was different. This wasn't suppression, it was strategic patience. Every morning, I checked my phone, expecting frantic calls about the missing money. Every evening, I came home, expecting to find my parents waiting in my apartment parking lot. But nothing happened. It took me 3 days to realize why they hadn't noticed. They weren't planning to touch the joint account until the day before Brandon's party, when they'd need to transfer funds to cover his immediate debts. In their minds, they had 6 more days before their financial manipulation needed to become reality. Those 6 days gave me time to implement the second phase of my plan. First, I documented everything one more time. I photographed every piece of evidence, uploaded it all to a secure cloud storage service, and created backup copies on 3 different devices. I also prepared a comprehensive timeline of their financial fraud, complete with dates, amounts, and forged signatures. This wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about ensuring they could never do this to anyone else. Next, I reached out to my credit card companies and banks to report the fraudulent accounts they'd opened in my name. the process was more straightforward than I'd expected. Armed with police report numbers and detailed documentation, I was able to have the unauthorized accounts closed and the debt removed from my credit report within 72 hours. The most satisfying call was to the business loan company that had approved the $85,000 using my forged signature. When I explained that I'd never authorized the loan and provided them with handwriting analysis from a document examiner, they immediately began fraud proceedings against my parents. The loan that was supposed to save Brandon's business became a federal investigation, but the real masterpiece was my communication strategy. Instead of confronting my parents directly, I sent a carefully crafted email to our extended family explaining the situation. I attached select pieces of evidence, enough to tell the story without overwhelming anyone with details. The email went to my Aunt Sarah, 3 cousins, my mom's brother, and 2 family friends who'd known us for decades. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts from family members, expressing shock, support, and their own stories of suspicious financial requests from my parents over the years. Apparently, I wasn't the only family member they'd been manipulating. My cousin Mike revealed that my parents had approached him 6 months earlier, asking to borrow $15,000 for Jessica's medical emergency. When he'd offered to send the money directly to me, they'd quickly backtracked and claimed the situation had resolved itself. My uncle David shared that they'd used my name to try to get him to co-sign a business loan for Brandon, claiming I was too busy with work to handle the paperwork myself. The pattern was clear and it was bigger than I'd imagined. My parents hadn't just been exploiting me, they'd been using my reputation and success to manipulate other family members. The fact that these relatives had been suspicious enough to verify the stories directly showed that my parents' credibility was already damaged. My email simply connected the dots that everyone had been privately wondering about. The most strategic element of my outreach was timing it for the Thursday before Brandon's weekend birthday celebration. By Friday evening, when my parents tried to access the joint account for their party preparations, half the family already knew the truth about their financial manipulation. The call came at 6:23 p.m. on Friday. My mom's name flashed on my phone screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I'd been preparing for this conversation all week. "Jessica, honey, there seems to be some kind of problem with the bank account," she said, her voice carrying that fake sweet tone she used when she needed something. "The transfer didn't go through for some reason. Can you call them and sort it out?" "What transfer?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "For Brandon's celebration tomorrow, remember? We discussed this." There was an edge creeping into her voice now. "Actually, Mom, I don't remember discussing any transfer. What exactly were you trying to transfer and where?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When she spoke again, the sweetness was completely gone. "Jessica, don't play games with me. We need that money for your brother's business obligations. This is family." "You're right," I said calmly. "This is family. That's why I'm so curious about why you've been opening credit accounts in my name without my permission, and why you forged my signature on Brandon's business loans. That seems like something family should discuss." Another long silence. I could hear muffled conversation in the background. She was covering the phone and talking to my dad. "I don't know what you think you found, But you're misunderstanding the situation, she said finally. We were protecting your credit by making sure those accounts were properly managed. The gaslighting was so immediate and so practiced that it took my breath away. Even caught red-handed with documented evidence, she was trying to reframe fraud as protection. Mom, I have copies of the forged documents. I have emails where you and Dad discuss making me pay for Brandon's debts without my knowledge. I have bank records showing unauthorized account openings. This isn't a misunderstanding, it's fraud. How dare you accuse your own parents of fraud? Her voice was rising now, the careful manipulation giving way to raw anger. After everything we've done for you, we raised you, we supported you, we made you who you are today. And I've repaid that support with over $180,000 in the last 10 years, I replied. But stealing my identity and forging my signature isn't support, it's crime. That money was just sitting there earning nothing, my dad's voice cut in. He'd taken the phone or picked up an extension. Brandon's business could have tripled your investment. We were looking out for your financial future. The audacity was stunning. They'd stolen my money and were now claiming it was financial advice. My financial future? I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. Dad, you've committed identity theft, bank fraud, and forgery. You've damaged my credit and pledged my assets without consent. The only financial future you've been looking out for is Brandon's. Jessica, you need to calm down and think about what you're saying, Mom interrupted. These are serious accusations you're making against your own family. They're serious crimes you've committed against your own family, I corrected. And since you brought up family, you should know that Aunt Sarah, Uncle David, and Mike all received interesting emails this week about your financial activities. The silence was deafening. I just revealed that their manipulation wasn't a secret anymore, and they knew exactly what that meant for their social standing in the family. You told the family our private business? Dad's voice was dangerous now. I told the family about fraud committed in my name. I told them about money stolen from my accounts. I told them about forged signatures and identity theft. If you consider crimes private business, that explains a lot about how we got here. Where's the money, Jessica? Brandon's voice was on the line now, and he sounded panicked. I have payments due Monday. I have employees depending on me. The money you're referring to was stolen from my account using forged documents, I said. I've secured my assets and reported the fraud to the appropriate authorities. If you have legitimate business expenses, I suggest you handle them through legitimate financing. You can't do this to me, Brandon's voice cracked. My business will collapse. Your business was already collapsing. That's why you needed to steal money to keep it afloat. We didn't steal anything, Mom interjected. That money was in a family account. An account I opened and funded entirely myself. Being co-signers doesn't give you ownership rights to money you didn't contribute. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, cycling through every manipulation technique they'd perfected over the years. They tried guilt. After everything we've sacrificed for you, they tried emotional blackmail. You're destroying this family. They tried gaslighting. You're remembering things wrong. And they tried threats. You'll regret this decision. But something had fundamentally shifted in our dynamic. For the first time in my adult life, I held the power in our relationship. They needed something from me, and I had the ability to say no without consequences. More importantly, I had evidence of their crimes and the family's support for my position. The call ended when I finally said, "This conversation is over. If you want to discuss this further, you can have your attorney contact mine." Then I hung up. My phone immediately started ringing again. I turned it off. Saturday morning brought a new level of chaos. My apartment buzzer started going off at 7 a.m. When I looked out my window, I could see my dad's truck in the parking lot. They'd driven over to confront me in person. I didn't answer the door. The buzzing continued for 30 minutes before they finally gave up. But they didn't leave. Instead, they stationed themselves in the parking lot like some kind of suburban stakeout, waiting for me to emerge. I texted my Aunt Sarah. "They're camped outside my apartment. Can I come stay with you today?" Her response was immediate. "Already on my way, pack a bag." Sarah arrived an hour later with her husband Tom and their teenage son. The sight of them getting out of their car and walking purposefully toward my building sent my parents into action. They intercepted Sarah before she reached the front door. I couldn't hear the conversation from my third-floor window, but the body language told the whole story. Sarah stood with her arms crossed, while my dad gestured frantically and my mom wiped her eyes with tissues. Tom positioned himself between Sarah and my parents, his posture making it clear he wasn't interested in their manipulation tactics. After 10 minutes, Sarah looked up at my window and pointed toward the back of the building. I understood immediately. She was telling me to meet them at the rear exit. I grabbed my overnight bag and slipped out the back way, while my parents continued their performance in the front parking lot. Sarah's car was waiting by the dumpsters, engine running. "How bad was it?" I asked as I climbed into the back seat. "Your mother tried to tell me you'd had some kind of mental breakdown and were making false accusations," Sarah said as we drove away. "Your father kept insisting they were just trying to help with your finances. What did you tell them?" I told them I'd seen the evidence myself, and that if they were really concerned about your mental health, they should probably explain why they'd committed fraud in your name. Tom chuckled from the driver's seat. "Your mom didn't like that very much. She started crying and saying I was turning the family against them," Sarah continued. "I told her they'd turned the family against themselves when they decided to commit crimes." We spent the day at Sarah's house, and she helped me understand something important. I wasn't responsible for managing my parents' emotions about the consequences of their actions. They were upset because they'd been caught, not because they were genuinely sorry. "Your mother called me 3 times this morning," Sarah said as we sat on her back porch with coffee. Each time she had a different story about what really happened. First, it was a misunderstanding. Then it was they were trying to help you. Finally, it was that Brandon manipulated them into it. None of those versions include taking responsibility, I observed. Exactly, and that tells you everything you need to know about whether they're actually sorry or just sorry they got caught. That evening, my phone, which I'd finally turned back on, had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The messages ranged from my parents' continued attempts at manipulation to supportive notes from extended family members. But the most interesting message was from Brandon himself, sent at 4 p.m. "Jessica, I'm sorry about what Mom and Dad did. I didn't know they were using your signature without permission. Can we meet somewhere and talk about a payment plan for what I owe you?" For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered that he'd been living off stolen money for months, while posting pictures of expensive dinners on social media. I didn't respond to any of the messages. Sunday brought a different kind of surprise. At 10 a.m., my doorbell rang again, but this time it wasn't my parents'. It was a process server with legal documents. My parents were suing me for unlawful seizure of family assets and breach of family trust. They were demanding the return of the $120,000 plus damages for the emotional distress I'd caused by making false accusations against them. I called my attorney immediately. "This is a nuisance lawsuit," she explained after reviewing the documents. "They're hoping to pressure you into settling, but given the evidence you've provided about their fraud, this could actually work in our favor." "How so?" "Because now they've made their claims under oath in a legal proceeding. If we can prove they committed fraud, which we can, they've just committed perjury as well." The lawsuit was exactly the opening I needed to bring everything into the light. Within 48 hours, my attorney had filed a countersuit, documenting every instance of fraud, identity theft, and financial manipulation. We also requested a restraining order to prevent them from attempting to open new accounts in my name. The local newspaper picked up the story 3 days later. "Family fraud case. Highlights elder financial abuse trends." While the article didn't use our real names, it detailed enough specifics that anyone who knew our family could identify us. That's when the real consequences began. My dad lost his job at the insurance company where he'd worked for 15 years. Apparently, having an active fraud investigation wasn't compatible with working in financial services. My mom's book club quietly asked her to take a temporary break from hosting meetings. Brandon's remaining business partners pulled out after learning about the fraud investigation. The social consequences were swift and comprehensive. In a community where reputation matters, being publicly associated with financial fraud was devastating. Family friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact. The country club they'd belonged to for a decade suddenly had a waiting list for membership renewals. But the most satisfying consequence was completely unexpected. 3 other family members came forward with their own stories of financial manipulation by my parents. My cousin Jennifer revealed that they'd borrowed $8,000 for emergency car repairs 2 years earlier and never paid it back. My uncle's business partner disclosed that my parents had tried to use my name as a reference for a business loan without my knowledge. Each revelation added to the legal case and further destroyed their credibility in the family. They'd spent years building a network of financial manipulation, and now that network was collapsing as victims came forward. The bankruptcy filing came 6 weeks later. Without access to my money or my credit, Brandon's business couldn't meet its obligations. The failure was spectacular and public, with local suppliers and employees all learning simultaneously that their payments weren't coming. My parents' own finances collapsed shortly after. The house they'd refinanced using my credit as collateral went into foreclosure when they couldn't make payments without Brandon's supposed business income. The cars they'd leased under my guarantor agreements were repossessed. Within 2 months, they'd lost their house, their cars, their jobs, and their social standing. The financial empire they'd built on my stolen identity crumbled completely. But here's what surprised me. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Watching them lose everything wasn't triumphant, it was just sad. These were people who'd had every opportunity to build a honest life, and they'd chosen manipulation and fraud instead. The real satisfaction came from somewhere else entirely. It came from the phone call I received from my cousin's daughter, a college sophomore who'd heard about our family drama through the grapevine. She called to tell me that my story had inspired her to set boundaries with her own financially manipulative parents. She'd decided to stop funding their vacations and credit card bills, and she was using her college savings to study abroad instead of bailing them out of debt. It came from the email I received from a coworker who'd noticed my increased confidence and productivity at work. She shared her own story of family financial abuse and asked for advice on protecting herself. It came from the promotion I received at work, partly because I was no longer constantly distracted by family financial crises, and partly because standing up for myself had taught me to advocate for my professional worth as well. Most importantly, it came from the life I was finally able to build without their interference. 6 months after transferring that money in the middle of the night, I bought my first house. Not a family house that everyone would have opinions about. Not a property that would serve as collateral for other people's debts. My house, purchased with my money, in my name only. I started dating seriously for the first time in years. Without the constant financial drain of family obligations, I had both the money and the emotional energy to invest in a relationship. I met David through a hiking group, and the first thing I noticed was how he responded when I offered to pay for dinner. "Thanks, but I've got this one. You can get the next one." Equal partnership instead of exploitation. I began traveling to places I'd always wanted to see, but couldn't afford while funding my family's lifestyle. I took photography classes, learned to rock climb, and discovered that I actually enjoyed spending money on myself when it wasn't being stolen faster than I could earn it. But the most profound change was internal. For the first time in my adult life, I trusted my own judgment. I stopped second-guessing my instincts about people's motives. I learned to recognize manipulation tactics immediately and shut them down without guilt. The no-contact boundary I'd established with my parents became permanent. They made several attempts to reconcile over the first year, but each attempt followed the same pattern. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no genuine apology, just expectations that I should move past their behavior and resume funding their lifestyle. I stopped responding entirely. The last communication I received from them was a birthday card with a note inside. "We forgive you for the misunderstanding. When you're ready to be family again, we'll be here." I threw it away without a second thought. 2 years later, I found out through my Aunt Sarah that they'd tried the same financial manipulation scheme with Brandon's new girlfriend, a nurse practitioner with a steady income and no knowledge of their history. Sarah had taken it upon herself to warn the girlfriend, who immediately ended the relationship. Some people never learn, but their inability to change didn't affect my life anymore, because I'd built a fortress of boundaries they couldn't penetrate. The money I'd rescued from their theft had grown to over $300,000 through careful investing. My career had flourished without the constant stress of family financial obligations. My relationship with David had progressed to the point where we were discussing marriage, a conversation that included detailed discussions about financial boundaries and family dynamics. Most importantly, I'd broken the cycle. If David and I had children someday, they would grow up understanding that love isn't conditional on financial usefulness. They would learn that healthy families support each other without exploitation. They would know the difference between helping someone and enabling them. The Jessica who had sat in her car that day, shaking after overhearing her parents' plan, felt like a different person entirely. She'd been trapped by a lifetime of conditioning that told her family love required financial sacrifice. She'd believed that setting boundaries was selfish, and that saying no meant she was ungrateful. The Jessica I'd become understood that real love doesn't require exploitation. Real family doesn't commit fraud against each other. Real support doesn't involve theft and manipulation. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for toxic people is to remove their ability to continue their destructive behavior. I'd discovered that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And I'd proven that it's never too late to reclaim your life from people who see you as a resource rather than a person. The greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's freedom. And for the first time in my adult life, I was completely, utterly free.